Good morning. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to mention our colleague Dan Kildee, who cannot be with us today as he's recovering from surgery related to his recent cancer diagnosis. Dan is a valuable member of this committee, and his absence will be felt, particularly today, as we take up a piece of legislation of which Dan is an original co-sponsor. We wish Dan a swift recovery and look forward to having him back with us. The committee meets today to consider HJ Res 39, disapproving the rule submitted by the Department of Commerce relating to procedures covering suspension of liquidation duties and estimated duties in accord with Presidential Proclamation 10414. I recognize myself now for an opening statement. As recently as this past December, the U.S. Department of Commerce determined that China is circumventing tariffs on imports by shipping solar products through Cambodia, Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam. Since 2012, the United States has imposed higher tariffs on most solar imports from China to provide a level playing field for American manufacturers and workers. And the Commerce Department determined that Chinese companies are shipping products through these four countries to avoid those very tariffs. This is further evidence of China's ongoing trade abuses. American workers and consumers are being cheated by this behavior and deserve the committee's action today that protects them. Unfortunately, months before the Commerce Department's determination, the White House made a misguided decision to remove the additional tariffs on Chinese solar products routed through those four countries for the next 2 years. That has sent a signal that there will be less, not more, accountability for unfair trade practices that have given China a dominant position in solar panel production despite long-standing American innovation in this sector. That is why this committee is acting today to reverse that decision, advancing House Joint Resolution 39, the Congressional Review Act legislation on solar tariffs. It will reverse the White House proclamation that has allowed more unfair solar imports from China into the United States. Today's resolution is an important step to ensure the United States maintains crucial protections for American workers and our economy as a whole. I'd like to thank the many sponsors of this resolution on both sides of the aisle, and I appreciate that concern for China's behavior is shared by so many of us. And I hope this is the first of several bipartisan things we can work together on as it relates to confronting the continued threat China poses on so many fronts. Members of the Ways and Means Committee clearly recognize that Congress must act in this instance to hold accountable bad actors in global trade, and in particular, Chinese wrongdoing. I'm pleased that today we can act in a bipartisan way to protect and defend American workers. I now recognize Ms. Chu for the purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Before I begin, I too would like to recognize our colleague Dan Kildee, who underwent a procedure earlier this week and cannot be with us in person today. I wish him a speedy recovery and look forward to his return to Congress and this committee soon. Well, trade connects us to the rest of the world, and our trade relationships must be built on a foundation of trust. As members of the Ways and Means Committee, it's our responsibility to balance a number of diverse considerations in our trade policies to ensure that we are providing benefits to American workers, companies, and consumers while demanding high enforceable standards for labor, the environment, and other priorities. House Democrats are focused on fighting climate change while supercharging our domestic manufacturing and energy workforce. As we will discuss in this committee shortly, the Inflation Reduction Act is the single largest investment in our nation's climate and energy in our history. It created tax incentives to quickly decarbonize our economy and shift manufacturing of the materials and technologies we need here to the United States. And that includes the supply of solar panels that will be critical to the clean energy transition. Late last year, after a thorough and data-driven investigation, the Commerce Department made a preliminary determination that some companies are bypassing anti-dumping countervailing duty orders on Chinese solar panels by doing minor processing in Cambodia, Malaysia, Thailand, or Vietnam before shipping to the United States. Last summer, the Biden administration issued a proclamation that created a short-term bridge delaying the implementation of any duties until next year. As in all trade policy, our approach to this requires balance, and I respect that my colleagues may come to different conclusions this morning about how to strike that balance. I plan to oppose the legislation before us today because I believe that it is not the right solution at this time. While the administration's emergency order is not perfect, it is a short-term intervention that gives solar projects in the pipeline the needed bridge. Trade policy works better when we find areas of agreement to build a fairer trading system, root out forced labor from our supply chains, and ensure that workers are at the forefront of our trade relationships. When we fought to establish new enforcement structures in the USMCA, we weren't just fighting for that deal. We were showing the world what we stand for and what's acceptable. This stands as a powerful example of what's possible. It's given weight to our word, and we must continue to fight for aggressive, enforceable trade policies. I'm committed to ensuring that our trade policies are well-balanced and reflect our values, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Chu. The committee will now proceed to consideration of HJ Res 39, disapproving the rule submitted by the Department of Commerce relating to procedures covering suspension of liquidation duties and estimated duties in accord with Presidential Proclamation 10414. Without objection, the measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I will now turn to Josh Sneed, Chief Trade Counsel, to provide the technical description of the resolution. I ask that members hold their questions until after his presentation.
Thank you, Chairman. HJ Res 39 is composed of a single sentence. This resolution disapproves of a final rule issued by the Department of Commerce in September 2022 to implement Presidential Proclamation 10414. This presidential proclamation declared an emergency with respect to the availability of sufficient electricity generation capacity, and on this basis directed the Secretary of Commerce to consider taking appropriate action to permit importation free of any new tariffs imposed under U.S. anti-dumping or countervailing duty law of solar cells and modules from Cambodia, Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam for a period of 24 months. The statutory authority President Biden cited for this proclamation was 19 U.S. Code Section 1318A, which empowers the President to proclaim an emergency by reason of a state of war or otherwise, and on the basis of that emergency to allow the importation free of duty of food, clothing, and medical, surgical, and other supplies for use in emergency relief work. The Commerce Department's final rule to implement this proclamation established that solar cells or modules from these four countries would not face new anti-dumping or countervailing duties until June 6, 2024, even if the Commerce Department itself concluded that these products are circumventing anti-dumping or countervailing duty orders on products from China. In December 2022, the Commerce Department issued preliminary affirmative determinations of circumvention with respect to all four countries. Under the normal operation of U.S. anti-dumping and countervailing duty law, upon issuing this preliminary determination, the Commerce Department would instruct U.S. Customs and Border Protection to suspend liquidation of entries of products covered by the determination and require collection of cash deposits sufficient to cover estimated duties that reflect the preliminary finding of circumvention. However, due to Proclamation 10414, as implemented by the Commerce Department's final rule, the Commerce Department did not instruct CBP to do so. If HJ Res 39 is enacted into law, as set forth in the Congressional Review Act, the result would be to prevent this final rule from having effect and prevent the Department of Commerce from issuing a rule that is substantially the same as this final rule.
Thank you. Are there any technical questions about the resolution? Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Mr. Sneed, in a circumvention case, the Commerce regulations state that in the event of an affirmative preliminary determination, Commerce will, quote, direct the Customs Service to begin the suspension, a liquidation, and require a cash deposit of estimated duties. Based on this regulation, do you agree that Commerce's regulations mandate the circumvention tariffs be applied retroactively if the CRA resolution passes? But basically, will we have to go back to April last year and collect duties, tariffs on everything that's been installed in that year?
My understanding would be yes. That would be the normal operation of the law. And just to confirm, as you know, the overall U.S. anti-dumping and countervailing duty system is retrospective. We always calculate duties after the fact, after entry.
Yeah, thank you. And that's certainly what I've been hearing from solar installers, even U.S. manufacturers that have used chips that have ultimately come from China would be hit with these things. So one more technical question, Mr. Chairman, if appropriate. Has there been any technical analysis on the effects of these retroactive tariffs on businesses and consumers?
Not to my knowledge. And one other thing to point out from a technical level is we do have a preliminary determination, but not a final determination. So there aren't actually final numbers that anyone could analyze. That won't come out until at least May.
And one last question, Mr. Sneed. What rule would govern the importation of the solar panels from the region if the CRA passes?
I'm not sure I understand. Could you clarify what?
Assume that this passes both houses and is signed by the president or whatever. What rule would be in place then to manage the importation of these panels?
The normal operation of our anti-dumping and countervailing duty laws. So we had a circumvention proceeding commence in April of 2022 pursuant to a petition, which is a normal process under Commerce's regulations. And so it would be our normal anti-dumping countervailing duty law as affected by Commerce's regulations. So it's a very well-known process, and also I should say an open process where every party has a chance to make submissions and even to appeal the findings in court.
Great, thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you. Any further technical questions? Seeing none, we'll move to strike the last word. Would any member like to strike the last word? Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word. Mr. Chairman, I share my colleague's goal of ensuring that our trade laws are fairly enforced, and I share our collective goal of promoting domestic manufacturing and jobs. As a matter of fact, that's exactly why my colleagues and I wrote the Inflation Reduction Act the way that we did. We put language in the bill to promote U.S. businesses, U.S. jobs, and the U.S. middle class. I'll have more to say about that later today when we move into the next segment of this hearing. But let's be clear about the resolution in front of us. If this resolution were to become law, which we know it won't, it would cost American jobs. And whatever short-term disentanglement it might offer, it would make it harder, not easier, for America to become energy independent in the long run. We have a climate crisis. Every week there's a new disaster, a wildfire, a hurricane, a flood, a tornado, a drought. And finally, after decades of work, Congress last year took the biggest step in history to decarbonize our economy and shift to renewable energy. We can't afford to kneecap this effort right out of the gate. The fact of the matter is the U.S. domestic solar industry cannot, at this time, meet demand. Our domestic market is saturated. If we're going to deploy solar energy rapidly, the way we need to, the reality is that Americans need short-term access to imported solar panels. In the long run, we all want those panels to be made here in the United States of America, and they will be. But our domestic industry cannot ramp up production that quickly. That's why the President issued this order and created a 2-year bridge, a glide path that allows for fast deployment of solar energy in the short term while domestic manufacturers build out capacity. I urge my colleagues to oppose this resolution, and I yield back.
Mr. Blumenauer, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I strongly concur with the comments from my colleague from California. President Biden struck the right balance by implementing a temporary freeze on these solar tariffs. And I think a number of us had been visited by representatives of the industry talking about the dilemma that they were going to face without having adequate supply and the potential of being subjected to retroactive tariffs. This 2-year bridge gives the solar industry the time needed to reorient the supply chains away from China and begin to produce panels domestically. I think it's very important that in our conversations with the solar industry, they're not seeking to make this permanent. They want to be able to extend the freeze just for this 14-month period to be able to establish domestic supply chains. For too long, America has lacked a cohesive renewable energy manufacturing policy. We've outsourced our production. A number of us have seen this in dismay in China over the years. In 2021, there were only 7 gigawatts of domestic manufacturer productivity. But the legislation this committee passed, the Inflation Reduction Act, marks a significant departure from these practices of the past. It bakes in domestic content bonuses to clean energy credits to incentivize the industry to deal with onshore production. It revives the advanced manufacturing credit and created a new manufacturing production tax credit. The Inflation Reduction Act has already led to the announcement of more than 45 gigabytes of domestic solar capacity, some of which comes from districts represented on this committee on both sides of the aisle. Supply chains don't change locations overnight. Ending the president's temporary ban would immediately institute these high retroactive tariffs in the hundreds of %, which would hurt solar development, increase energy costs, and lead to a supply reduction at exactly the time we need to ramp up production. Many of us on this committee worked for years to achieve the policy victories that were contained in the Inflation Reduction Act. The clean energy tax credits are projected to reduce carbon emissions 40% by 2030, giving us a legitimate chance to meet the goals contained in the Paris Climate Agreement. We should resist the efforts to undermine our hard-won victory and put us on a path for a low-carbon future. I would strongly encourage my colleagues to take a hard look at this legislation and reject it when it comes for us for a vote.
Ms. Sewell is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word. For me, this resolution is simply about enforcement. During the USMCA negotiations, Speaker Pelosi appointed Rosa DeLauro and me to improve the enforcement provisions of the old NAFTA agreement. We crafted new progressive enforcement standards, which became the foundation of USMCA, and the Biden administration has used these enforcement tools to level the playing field for American workers and improve worker rights in North America. When we prioritize enforcement, we are standing up for American workers and the rules-based international trade system. One of the fundamental enforcement tools that we have at our disposal is the anti-dumping, countervailing duty laws. Many Alabama workers, including my steel workers, depend upon these laws to protect their sector from dumped Chinese steel. In fact, I have a bill called the Leveling the Playing Field Act, which would strengthen our anti-dumping, countervailing duty enforcement protections by allowing the Department of Commerce to defend against Chinese cross-border subsidies. Now is the time to strengthen our AD/CVD enforcement protections, not weaken them. I agree that climate change is an immediate threat and that we must do all that we can to rapidly transition to renewable energy sources like solar. But now that Democrats have passed the historic climate provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act, Our domestic solar industry and our other solar producers around the globe that do not cheat our trade laws are poised to rapidly expand the clean production of solar panels. At the end of the day, this resolution is about enforcement of our trade laws. I ask my colleagues to vote in favor of the resolution, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Davis is recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word. Renewable energy is a promising technology that is a growing solution to solve the U.S. dependency on oil and gas, which cause concerns about high energy prices, economic uncertainty, and greenhouse gas emissions, along with other factors that are implicated as causes of environmental and global climate change. This technology, implemented as causes, this technology generates electricity from the sun, wind, and biomass. Solar energy is one form of electricity generation that is growing in the United States. Yet we do not have the economy of scale in manufacturing solar systems to meet supply and demand for industry and consumers. Solar energy accounts for 3.9% of total electricity generation in 2021, compared to 0.7% in 2014. Some believe that much of the problem that is hindering U.S. domestic manufacturing and supply of solar products is due to not appropriately addressing China's unfair trade policies with respect to forced and slave labor, human rights abuses, state-owned manufacturing companies, product dumping, and intellectual property rights, and other Southeast Asian countries serving as proxy for exporting products to the United States. All of these practices have a bearing on our industrial development, on producing alternative energy products, especially solar systems. When Democrats passed the American Competes Act, many Republicans overwhelmingly voted no on a bipartisan legislative initiative to increase manufacturing jobs and technology, production of semiconductor chips, and strengthening the supply chain to make more goods in our country, invest in scientific research and new technologies, while encouraging strong labor standards and human rights. In order to continue to address China's unfair trading practices and allow America's solar energy to grow, President Biden's Proclamation 10414 declared an emergency with respect to U.S. electricity generation capacity by implementing a final rule that permits the importation of select sales or modulars without the payment of anti-dumping and countervailing duty temporary for 24 months. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and yield back.
Gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Schweikert, is recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have the articles in one of my binders. I should have brought them. For our friends here on this panel that actually say their single biggest focus on this was greenhouse gases. It was talking about how dirty the manufacturing in substantial parts of China are. And it's an academic article. It basically said, the punchline on it was, it takes 8 to 10 years of production of these Chinese solar panels to offset the amount of greenhouse gases because they're made with very, very, very dirty coal-based energy without scrubbers. So if the intellectual honesty here is we are going to remove these tariffs because we want to actually do a carbon offset, greenhouse gas offset, you actually haven't accomplished that. You've only accomplished virtue signaling. And so if we're going to be intellectually honest, if it's about the environment, you need a very different scoring system than just lifting these tariffs, because you're bringing in products that were made in filthy energy-based production. And with that, I yield back.
Mr. Larson is recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, and the gentlelady from California for talking about our distinguished colleague, Dan Kildee, and we all wish him well. I want to associate myself with remarks of Mr. Thompson and Mr. Blumenauer. And with that, however, yield to the gentlelady from Alabama for the remainder of my time.
I'd like to read the statement of our colleague, Dan Kildee. Unfortunately, due to my cancer diagnosis, I am not able to be at the hearing today, but I want to provide a written statement on my resolution, HJ Res 39. I am proud to have worked with President Biden and his administration on important new laws that are helping to bring back critical manufacturing and create good-paying jobs in America. New laws like the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the CHIPS and Science Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act are helping to grow our economy and make Michiganders back to work and put them back to work. However, when it comes to this policy, I disagree with the President. Our trade laws enacted by Congress are meant to protect American manufacturers and American workers from the unfair trade practices. For too long, bad trade deals and unfair trade practices by other countries have hurt American workers. I believe that we need to enforce our current trade laws and strengthen our ability to fight unfair trade practices. In 2012, former President Obama applied tariffs to solar panels imported from China because Chinese companies were benefiting from unfair trade practices. These unfair trade practices are continuing today. When companies try to evade or circumvent our trade laws, they must be held accountable. The Biden administration has found in its own investigation that companies are evading U.S. tariffs on solar imports, but has suspended enforcement action on this matter. This, I believe, is unacceptable for the workers I represent. By suspending tariffs on those who violate our trade laws, we are rewarding their bad behavior and penalizing companies that do follow the law. This should not be a partisan issue. We cannot allow foreign solar manufacturers to violate trade laws, especially when it comes at the expense of American workers and American businesses. By suspending tariffs on those who violate our trade laws, we are undermining our own American manufacturers and workers. By suspending tariffs on those who violate our trade laws, we are making us more reliant, not less reliant, on China for our manufacturing and clean energy needs. The Chinese Communist Party has also been found by the United Nations Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights to be responsible for serious human rights violations for the treatment of Uyghurs, and China's polysilicon and solar manufacturing industry relying heavily on mining and manufacturing in Xinjiang. We must care about how products are made when they are sold in the United States. Fair trade is important, and climate change is real, and addressing it is also important. But we cannot be short-sighted in our efforts as we rely on foreign companies and countries to meet our energy or climate goals, especially when they have been in violation of U.S. trade laws. It is a false choice to suggest that we can either choose to combat climate change or protect American workers and manufacturers. We, in fact, can do both. I ask my colleagues to vote yes on this bipartisan legislation, and I yield back to Mr. Larson, and we all wish Dan a very speedy recovery.
Thank you. Gentleman from Ohio is recognized to strike the last word.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've consistently voiced my strong concern with allowing critical supply chains for key products to our national security like food, energy, and medicine to be reliant upon global adversaries like China. And we must think long-term for the sake of our nation overall. The solar industry is an example of exactly what we're concerned about. The entire value chain for solar energy runs through China. from the base material of polysilicon to the cells that make up a finished solar energy panel. This is an incredibly concerning situation, and to make matters worse, Chinese production of solar products is concentrated in the Xinjiang region, where ethnic genocide is taking place against the Uyghur Muslim population. The Chinese Communist Party's campaign of forced labor, as well as abhorrent forced sterilization and ethnic cleansing, is a gross violation of human rights, and I'm glad that Congress has responded by passing the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act to ensure that no imports to the U.S. are sourced from companies utilizing forced labor. The measure we are considering today, however, is focused solely on addressing unfair trade practices from Chinese solar producers who have attempted to circumvent U.S. trade law by relocating their production in third countries not subject to existing tariffs on Chinese solar panels. In March 2022, I led a letter with my colleague, Mr. Pascrell, simply asking the Department of Commerce to conduct a full and fair investigation of allegations that Chinese solar producers were circumventing the existing anti-dumping and countervailing duties on solar cells and modules from China. The Department of Commerce has determined on a preliminary basis that circumvention is occurring, and if confirmed in its final investigation, products from those companies found to be circumventing would be subject to tariffs in accordance with our trade laws. That would be the case. But instead, the President decided to subvert U.S. trade law by issuing an emergency proclamation that declares all imports, even those found to be circumventing, will not be subject to tariffs until June of 2024. I don't hold any grudge against the solar installers who are seeking to expand solar energy production in the United States. Many solar projects are taking place in my district, and I do believe in an all-of-the-above energy policy that supports whatever form of energy makes sense for the community. But that doesn't mean we should provide special treatment for unfairly traded solar panels that rely on supply chains dominated by our adversaries. And I do hope that this further drives the conversation to work to have a 100% domestic supply chain for energy, regardless of the energy source. This is a national security issue, a long-term issue. The administration may be comfortable subverting our trade laws to achieve their goal of speeding up solar deployment, but I don't think Congress should be comfortable with that, and I hope my colleagues will agree. I support Resolution 39, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized to strike the last word.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and I move to strike the last word. And I appreciate the concerns of my friends who support this measure, but to me this is a straightforward issue, and I urge you to vote no. First, this proposal would directly harm our ability to meet our climate goals. And I may not be the only one, but I definitely believe that climate change is the existential issue before our generation. It's the one that affects every single person on this planet. U.S. solar manufacturing is not just sufficient, it's just not sufficient right now to meet the current demand, which is, by the way, overwhelmingly in red states. And this measure would dramatically slow down solar installation. The UN IPCC report that came out last month underscored that we simply don't have time to lose if we are to avoid the catastrophic effects of climate change. We must not lose sight of the urgency of the situation we're in. As the UN Secretary General said, our world needs climate action on all fronts, everything, everywhere, all at once. Pulling the rug out from under a key renewable sector at this point is in direct conflict with what I know is a key priority for many of us on this committee. Every year, every month, every day matters when it comes to climate. If this measure passes, future solar projects will be canceled or delayed, and carbon emissions will increase as a result by as much as 42 million metric tons. Even the short period of uncertainty last year, before the President issued his pause on tariffs, contributed to a significant drop in solar deployment in 2022. The National Renewable Energy Laboratory reported large decreases in utility and residential scale installations in 2022 compared to 2021. And given that some companies could be hit with new and retroactive tariffs on installations that are already up and running, I can only imagine what the ensuing chaos would do to future deployment and to businesses in America. This, in short, could be devastating to our climate goals. By the way, this does not come at the expense of American workers. This CRA will cost us American jobs. According to the International Union of Operating Engineers, this change in policy would eliminate up to 30,000 high-quality jobs and 4,000 manufacturing positions and billions of dollars in domestic investment. The operating engineers, LIUNA, the carpenters, any of the unions that have engaged in this have all come out against it. And Mr. Chairman, I would like to submit 2 of the letters for the record.
Without objections.
The root of this issue is the small size or domestic solar manufacturing sector. Domestic manufacturers are sold out years in advance, and the backlog only continues to grow, so the much larger installation industry is forced to look elsewhere to make up the difference and fill current demand. Fortunately, we addressed this imbalance with the Inflation Reduction Act and understand that we need to accelerate the growth of domestic manufacturing to better compete with cheaper alternatives abroad. We included tax incentives in the IRA to accomplish that goal. And the pause on tariffs on imported panels was intended to give the industry the time it needs to transition away from the suppliers in China and source elsewhere. Domestic capacity will not rise any faster if the CRA passes, and if we dramatically raise the costs on imported panels with no transition period, installations will decrease and the jobs that support them will disappear. And lastly, the CRA will increase energy prices and hurt consumers. This measure could lead to the cancellation of 4 gigawatts of solar projects. Couldn't come at a worse time for our constituents who are only now beginning to see relief from the high energy prices. My Republican colleagues only a few weeks ago all voted for H.R. 1, the Lower Energy Costs Act. But how can you vote for a measure that would go against the stated goal of one of your flagship bills? I would also note that the solar installation has grown fastest in traditionally Republican congressional districts in the Southeast and Southwest, and these are the areas that will face the sharpest negative impacts, energy price increases because of that. One of the primary goals of the Inflation Reduction Act was to increase the supply of renewable energy and reduce prices for consumers. This bill would undercut that effort. It also undermined the administration as it works to manage the transition away from fossil fuels and to relocate critical supply chains away from China. I also understand that this bill would be vetoed by the administration in any case. For these reasons, I again urge all my colleagues to vote no. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to point out a couple of items as we're looking at this resolution, of which I support. Number one, when we look at the Chinese and what they've done worldwide, we know that the cobalt mining that has taken place in the Congo, I believe 15 of the 17 mines that are operated there with no environmental regulations, some of the worst labor practices in the world are being held by the Chinese, because the Chinese control those mines. My dear colleague mentioned about 4 gigawatts. Let me just point out something for the members of this committee, because I think it's important. Throughout 2022, China granted permits, Chinese granted permits for 106 gigawatts of capacity of coal-fired production in 82 different sites around China. This is equivalent to starting 2 new large coal plants per week in the nation of China. Now, let me put this so you can kind of understand. China has 6 times as many power plants being built in their nation as the rest of the world combined. We're talking about fair labor practices. We're talking about fair trade practices. Let's support this resolution. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from California is recognized. Mr. Panetta.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word. Thank you. I commend my colleague, Mr. Kildee, and his staunch commitment to trade enforcement. And of course, like my colleagues, I wish him a very, very swift recovery. But after careful consideration, I do oppose this resolution before us today. Now, obviously, climate change and extreme weather events are real threats to my constituents in the 19th Congressional District in California, and I do believe that we cannot afford delays in solar deployment, especially our domestic solar deployment. Now, I do believe that the Congressional Review Act resolution that we're voting on today would have a serious impact on the deployment of domestic solar. Serious impact on the timely deployment of domestic solar, especially. That's why I applaud the Biden administration's decision to institute a 2-year delay on the Commerce Department's circumvention duties to provide a bridge to the solar industry to adjust their supply chains while continuing to meet U.S. demand. Now, I'm concerned that by repealing the 2-year delay, the U.S. solar industry could be hit with more than $1 billion in retroactive duties that could wreak havoc on the solar industry in California and will lead to canceled projects. There are some estimates concluding that the U.S. could lose up to 4 gigawatts of solar deployment, which is 14% of the anticipated 2023 deployment. That could increase our CO2 emissions by 24 million metric tons. There is also evidence that this Commerce Department's investigation has already slowed solar deployment in the United States, and ending the delay will only lead to more roadblocks, cancellations, and thousands of lost jobs. Now, it won't be easy to replace supply to mitigate these impacts. At this time, 80% of our solar panel imports come from Southeast Asia, and domestic-made solar panels can only meet 1/3 of U.S. demand. U.S. producers, unfortunately, as we've heard, are sold out for the next 2 to 3 years. Now, I also recognize that we must do more to bolster our domestic manufacturing, and I'm proud of the investments we made in the IRA to do so. Thanks to domestic manufacturing credits of the IRA, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory has identified 42 gigawatts of new domestic solar panel manufacturing capacity. I'm afraid, though, that retroactive tariffs will set us back on that mission. It will deprive our solar industry of the capital needed to invest in domestic manufacturing products. I also want to address a key dispute regarding what constitutes circumvention in this case. I respect the Commerce's authority to determine what parts of the manufacturing process are considered domestic and which raise circumvention concerns. However, it is clear that solar manufacturers have been following a precedent previously set by Commerce, in which the location of solar cell manufacturing determines the country of origin of a solar module. Commerce has now clarified that in determining circumvention, the creation of solar wafers and other inputs is key to this determination. Now, I believe that Commerce has the right to make this clarification, and I do not dispute Commerce's methods. However, I believe this represents a change in expectations, and therefore it is fair to provide more time for our solar industry to adjust. I believe that President Biden made a tough call, even if as difficult as it was, in providing certainty to the industry and giving the domestic deployment of solar the time to do their job. I oppose this resolution, and I encourage my colleagues to do the same. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Are there additional members to strike the last word? Seeing none, we'll move to amendments. Are there any amendments? Seeing none, I will now recognize Mr. Buchanan for the purpose of offering a motion. Mr. Buchanan.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably report H.J. Res. 39 to the House of Representatives.
The question is on the motion to favorably report H.J. Res. 39 to the House of Representatives. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Buchanan?
Yes.
Mr. Buchanan? Yes. Mr. Smith of Nebraska?
Yes.
Mr. Smith of Nebraska? Yes. Mr. Kelly?
Yes.
Mr. Kelly? Yes. Mr. Schweikert? Mr. Schweikert? Yes. Mr. LaHood?
Yes.
Mr. LaHood? Yes. Dr. Winstrup? Dr. Winstrup? Yes. Mr. Arrington? Mr. Arrington? Yes. Dr. Ferguson? Dr. Ferguson? Yes. Mr. Estes? Mr. Estes? Yes. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker? Aye. Mr. Hearn?
Aye.
Mr. Hearn? Aye. Mrs. Miller?
Aye.
Mrs. Miller? Aye. Dr. Murphy?
Yes.
Dr. Murphy? Yes. Mr. Kustoff?
Aye.
Mr. Kustoff? Aye. Mr. Fitzpatrick? Aye. Mr. Fitzpatrick? Aye. Mr. Stube? Yes. Mr. Stube? Yes. Miss Tenney? Miss Tenney? Aye. Mrs. Fishbach?
Aye.
Mrs. Fishbach? Aye. Mr. Moore?
Aye.
Mr. Moore? Aye. Mrs. Steele? Mrs. Steele? Aye. Miss Van Dyne?
Aye.
Miss Van Dyne? Aye. Mr. Feenstra?
Aye.
Mr. Feenstra? Aye. Miss Maliotakis?
Aye.
Miss Maliotakis? Aye. Mr. Carey?
Aye.
Mr. Carey? Aye. Mr. Neal? Mr. Doggett? Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson? No. Mr. Larson? Mr. Larson? No. Mr. Blumenauer? Mr. Blumenauer? No. Mr. Pascrell? Mr. Davis? No. Mr. Davis? No. Ms. Sanchez? No. Ms. Sanchez? No. Mr. Higgins?
No.
Mr. Higgins? No. Ms. Sewell?
Yes.
Ms. Sewell? Yes. Ms. Del Bene? Ms. Del Bene? No. Ms. Chu? Ms. Chu? No. Ms. Moore? Ms. Moore? No. Mr. Kildee? Mr. Byer?
No.
Mr. Byer? No. Mr. Evans?
No.
Mr. Evans? No. Mr. Schneider?
No.
Mr. Schneider? No. Mr. Panetta? Mr. Panetta? No. Mr. Neal? Mr. Doggett? Mr. Pascrell? Mr. Kildee? Chairman Smith?
Yes.
Chairman Smith? Yes.
The clerk will report the vote.
(26 yeas, 13 nays).
There being 26 yeses and 13 noes, the motion is agreed to and HJ Resolution 39 is ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, I ask that staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the resolution and that members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental additional dissenting or minority views. There being no further business before the committee stands adjourned. We will convene the hearing at 10 o'clock.